All right, so we're kind of continuing on with the revolution in Mexico. Obviously, at the end of the last video, Mr. Hoyt talked about how in the textbook that we have, it says that peace spread throughout Mexico. But we're kind of looking at, is that true? What are the actual historical factors here? And did peace really spread throughout? Did the revolution actually end? Was the revolution actually successful? A question that did come up was regionalism. What is regionalism? And regionalism is where the government would be based more on regions versus a central like state government over an entire like a central federal government versus a regional government like the San Cristobal area or the when we were talking about Pancho Villa, the areas that they were either in the north or the south. So it's more of a regional type government that these people were looking for. When we're talking about the Zapatista, when we're talking about the failure or success of this revolution, since this revolution is technically not over, I would argue, it wasn't much of a success. So what's interesting is there's this group of rural farmers in southern Mexico that rebelled again in the 1990s. They refer themselves as Zapatistas, obviously referring to the man that was revolting in that area. But what's interesting about this group is that they are still trying to keep their independence. They are running themselves as their own government. They are continuing to do this even today. But what's really interesting and what I think is fascinating is that in 1990, this group of people went and occupied the cities that surrounded them for 48 hours. They went in, barricaded doors, and declared war on the state of Mexico. And the reason why this group went into these cities and barricaded themselves and occupied it and declared war was because the state was getting rid of or repealing Article 27 in that 1917 Constitution that said that the native lands could not be privatized or interfered with. And so this spread a lot of fear throughout the Zapatistas because this would potentially cause issues with them regarding the government, and their lands that are theirs have the potential of being taken away. And again, this was part of the fight originally with the Mexican Revolution. So for this to be an issue popping again in the 1990s, they declared war on Mexico. They then disappeared really quickly before the Mexican military came in and went back into their areas. But just the interesting fact of this is that this group is still in continuation today. Would you like to continue on, Mr. Hoyt?
Yeah, I think like that regionalization component of this is like the biggest part of it, is that Mexico is a huge country, and it's very different if you're in Mexico City than it is if you're in like the far north, like in like the state of like say Sonora, or you're in like the far south in like a state like Chiapas. And that would be true in 1910, which is why it was so difficult for people who like were in central parts of Mexico City to identify with and think of themselves as part of the same country as people like Emiliano Zapata in the south or Pancho Villa in the north. And like that's the same thing now, that like people who live in Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world, don't necessarily have a lot to connect with people who are in the very far south in these really rural, like dense jungle spaces, who are more of an indigenous population, who don't think of themselves as Mexican, and they may not even speak Spanish like their like fellow countrymen in Mexico City. They might speak an indigenous language. And so Ms. McClune touched on this like removal of Article 27 from the 1917 Constitution in the 1990s. And the fears around that kind of got even more extreme in 1994 when the United States, Canada, and Mexico created a trade agreement to have more free-flowing both like money and goods from one country into the other and into the other, so that like it would be more continuous economic space. And the fear that these southern Mexicans, I'll use like the phrase Mexicans, but like they would consider themselves Zapatistas, not part of the state of Mexico. Their fear was that people from outside of their region or outside of the towns that they lived in were going to come in and take up all of the land that was collectively owned by like the mostly indigenous population and use it to produce goods that would then be exported or taken to the United States and Canada at no benefit to the working people on the land, which is tied back to that like claim that Zapata was like a man who was trying to fight for indigenous rights. So like the sign on the left, no la tierra no se vende, se trabaja, y se defiende, is that like the land is for the people and it's not for it to be sold. Like those who work it are going to defend it. And so this like whole region is designed or like set up by a group of people who are like, this land is ours collectively. And it's not like owned by any one person. And so their fear is that the government is like trying to come in and like take that from them. And then even into like the really recent past, like still going on right now, the current president of Mexico wants to build a train that loops the Yucatan Peninsula to give better access, both from a tourism standpoint, but also to like the economics of like the agricultural opportunities that are in that region. And the Zapatistas, who like Ms. McLuhan said, like are like super militarized and like try to be like really secretive, like the man on the far left who has the balaclava on, like they're really opposed to this decision to try to build a train through this rural part of Mexico that they want to protect the rights of the indigenous people who live there. So I guess in summary, like the legacy of this revolution is that there's still components of it that live on. And we see that in a group that still identifies itself with Emiliano Zapata, someone who died almost over 100 years ago in the name of the same causes.